Right. So everybody listening to us, whether it's on the podcast or on the radio, we firstly thank you so much for listening to our show in general. If you're listening to us on the podcasting platforms, YouTube or Spotify, all the nits and crannies. I know there's 100 friggin' podcasting sites now. We thank you for that. If you're listening to us on the radio, we appreciate that. Obviously, you can't subscribe or share this interview, but we do hope you tell the owners of the radio station you're listening at that you really enjoy our interviews so we can keep definitely growing and keep pushing these interviews out. So we appreciate wherever you're listening to us. We have a special guest on, Diane Sear. She's running for U.S. Senate in the state of New York. Diane, her website is SARE4FOR Senate.com, and she's running as an independent. Diane, thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate you.
Well, thanks very much for having me. I'm glad to be here, especially in this era of censorship.
Yeah, you ain't kidding. You can tell me that 100 times. We've had many big guests that have been doctors in COVID-19 that have came on our show, and they've been censored for the majority of time. It's getting a little bit better now, but it's still a lot of censorship going on, especially on YouTube and these other podcasting platforms. But we're thankful to have you on because you have a very unique story. I do want the audience to hear it from your mouth. Can you tell the audience as we start this interview, Diane, a little bit about yourself, growing up and how you got into politics in general?
Sure, I'd be glad to. Well, I grew up mostly in Maine. My family were Quakers going on my father's side way back, including to the Mayflower. And he actually, although he was Quaker, got drafted to go to Vietnam and went there and did medical things, actually public health. And so he was doing his residency in Vermont. We moved to Ohio. My sister was born there. Then we moved to Albuquerque, New Mexico, while he was in Vietnam. But some of my earliest memories are going with my mother to visit widows from Vietnam. And how much, when you blow these seeds off the dandelion and you're supposed to get a wish, all I ever wished about was that this war would end. And that was maybe my first political identity at the age of about 4, that concern. So then later, when I was a student at New England Conservatory in Massachusetts, I ran into organizers for Lyndon LaRouche, who was then a presidential candidate, but who had just been indicted by none other than Robert Mueller, the very one that went after Donald Trump, this whole discredited Russiagate business. And given my Quaker background, unlike many people who were freaked out that they seemed very determined to send Mr. LaRouche to jail. And I'll say the first case in Boston actually fell apart for numerous reasons, including Oliver North and Bush Sr., because the government the judge became convinced that there was evidence of a political witch hunt going on once they found documents in Oliver North's safe alluding to LaRouche. And once that happened, he gave us permission to search the files of then Vice President Bush, H.W. Bush, Reagan's vice president, at which point, I know this will come as a big shock, the trial suddenly ended in a mistrial. They didn't want us getting those files from H.W. Bush on Iran-Contra, the drug running, the gun running, everything they were involved in. But it was clear they were determined to silence LaRouche and this movement. So for me, with my Quaker background, all of the people who had been involved in opposing slavery spent a lot of time in prison. So I thought, well, if you're really serious about fighting injustice, probably they're going to come after you. So for me, the witch hunt against LaRouche was more of a selling point. And I say that because people say, well, are you really aware what you're up against? How do I know I can trust you? How do I know you're not going to sell out? Well, I've been in a fight for 35 years against exactly this treasonous apparatus that is behind these wars. And the wars, it's not, Ray McGovern has made a longer name than military industrial complex. I think it's Mickey Matt Military Industrial Congressional, I forget, intelligence, academia, think tank complex, right? It's everything. But I would say the big one is, and people have identified it as the World Economic Forum, it's the financial interests. And we know that Mark Carney, when he was the head of Bank of England, came to Jackson Hole, Wyoming in 2019 and gave a speech which should send shivers down anyone's spine, because he said we need regime change. And what did he mean? We need to overthrow sovereign governments and have central bankers make policy. And that's the key. And that's really what we're up against. And that requires a certain amount of courage and willingness to face being blacked out and censored, and know that their system will fail. It is failing. 2,000 banks in the US are about to go under right now. Yeah. So can we seize that opportunity to establish a new system that's more in keeping with the Constitution of the United States?
So you bring up a lot of different things, and it's like almost you're answering my questions without even knowing them. I agree with you 100%. I want to dive a little deeper into what you're talking about, because we had a lot of audience questions when we spoke about, these are mostly about issues as far as dealing with, that you would deal with, I should say, as a U.S. Senator. Maybe we'll just get into that. I did have some other questions, but we'll tab on those throughout the interview. Again, for people listening, it's SARE4Senate.com. Diane Sear here on Fire Breathing Rob. Let's talk about some opinions on some issues. Since you brought up many, I think this is going to be an easy one for you. And I know there was a young guy named Jose that's really been running around the state of New York, really telling a lot of these politicians who are criminals, in my mind, off in plain English, and really fighting for Americans such as myself and Americans all around the country that don't believe in this war in Ukraine. I'm pretty sure between what he's doing and what you've been saying at the beginning of this interview that you're pretty much against this Ukraine war, correct?
Sure. And let me say more, because I think there's been a major sea change and they're having a real hard time with it in the West, which is the fall of Bakhmut, right? Or
educate us a little bit on that.
Well, now it's going to be known as Artemovsk, but it's a city in the Donbass. It has a lot of rail corridors. It's a central transportation hub, which is why perhaps they considered it strategic. But General Surovikin, who I guess is known as General Armageddon, when he came in, when Putin realized, I think initially the Russians went in soft because this, in a way, is like a civil war. And I've been at meetings where I've heard people say, my daughter is in the Ukrainian army, my son is in the Russian army. Every morning I wake up and I am terrified. So the Russians did not want to go in and just slaughter everyone indiscriminately. And in fact, to this day, everybody and their brother and their mother and their aunt can go. I mean, Jill Biden went to Kiev, for God's sake. So don't tell me about how Russia is obliterating the place. If Jill Biden can still go to Kiev, obviously they've been strategic about what they're doing. They didn't want to level the place. So what happened is early on, they thought Ukraine might back down, might not want to go through the destruction. And in fact, Zelensky was on the brink of negotiating in April of 2022. And what happened? Boris Johnson, who has such a monstrous ego that he probably had to fly a jumbo jet. And by the way, he's in Texas right now trying to make sure that the Ukraine war is supported. So we have Brits flying around the United States trying to keep this thing going. So Boris Johnson goes over there and says, don't negotiate, don't surrender. We will arm you. We will arm you. It's sick. It's like, those graters that you take cheese right through the grater. It's like saying, we're going to keep grating the cheese. We're going to grind up every last Ukrainian for our agenda. And Zelensky, who is probably on drugs, that's what I've heard. And he's an egomaniac, and he may have
Well, he's a
wanted.
comedian. He was a comedian.
Right.
So we had the game show host. They have the comedian.
Right.
The world is a joke. But anyways, go ahead,
Right.
Diane.
So at any rate, after that, they brought in this General Armageddon, who said, somehow we have to win. And it became clear once Angela Merkel and Hollande admitted that the whole Minsk process was a fraud, that they never intended to stop slaughtering ethnic Russians in the Donbass. They were only buying time to arm and train. And the Brits said they trained something like 55,000 Ukrainian soldiers.
This is going back, just to interrupt, and I apologize for interrupting you, but for the people listening in, this is going back to the Obama administration, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
2013, 2014. Victoria Nuland, who was in the Obama administration, is now in the Biden administration, was out there at a violent coup where they were beating up parliamentarians with baseball bats, setting the police on fire with Molotov cocktails. She was handing out cupcakes to these so-called democratic protesters, and they became the government. And they revived the legacy of Stepan Bandera, who was the total collaborator of Adolf Hitler and killed hundreds of thousands of Jews and Poles and Russians. His birthday is now a national holiday in Ukraine. And people march around with pictures of it. Would be like in Germany, marching around with pictures of Adolf Hitler. This is so would Russia be uncomfortable? I don't know. 1 out of 6 people there was killed by the Nazis. You don't want them to have a nuclear weapon. You can really see Putin's position. So at any rate, it became clear Minsk was a fraud, that the Ukrainian army had been trained and armed to the teeth, and that they were going to fight a different kind of war. So I think Russia concluded the only way out of this was a military victory. And they had the Wagner Brigade, which is a mercenary, operation headed by this guy Prigozhin, who's kind of a wild man, go in there and just fight for 224 days. But Zelensky was staking everything on this city. And when he got confronted at the G7 meeting that Bakhmut had fallen, the first thing he said is, I don't think so. He couldn't even face it. This shift means everything that we've been told in the West about how Ukraine is going to win. And I guess people never looked at a map. All you have to do is look at the size of these countries. But at any rate, Ukraine is going to win. We got to keep arming them. If we just arm them, they're going to win. That's done. It's over. This changes everything. And it's being sort of blacked out, but it doesn't matter. And I'll tell you, F-16 fighter jets, while an idiotic escalation, are not going to change the battle, just like the Patriot missile systems. Everyone said, oh, no, the Russians just obliterated 1 out of the 2 Patriot missile systems there. No longer is there.
So then if you get into the U.S. Senate, again, even people that I voted for, I used to respect, like Bernie Sanders, are voting for this war. Elizabeth Warren, all these people that are so-called progressives, anti-war people, they're all voting for this war now. Bernie Sanders, stood up against the Iraq war, and now they're all going with the program. So, you get in, as far as New York goes. With that said, you're just one person. All these guys are on that military-industrial complex money train. That's where they're getting their money. What can you do as one person in the Senate?
Well, I think if I were to get in, there would be somewhat of a revolution. So I don't think I am one person. And also, look, I think there's others who are just not courageous or not courageous enough. There's a few people. Rand Paul has spoken out against this. And you have a group in the House that introduced legislation to stop the funding, but they need a champion. They need someone who's not worried about sucking up to this or that moneyed interest. So I think I would be sort of a rallying point for those people of courage or of principle, I will say, to come forward. And I do think also there's a principle in the universe of truth Truth
Mm.
has far more power than lies. Otherwise, they wouldn't need dictatorships. They could just tell their lies and everyone would believe it. The reason why they have to bring in police state style methods is because lies are actually hard to enforce, and the truth has a way of resonating and making itself known. And particularly when they lose control of the banking system, it would be one thing if everyone was doing great and the price of eggs was 50 cents a dozen and it cost $5 to fill your car and 1 week's pay would cover your rent, your car insurance, and everything else. No one's living that way now. So reality is on my side as far as that goes. And my biggest concern is, as this thing disintegrates, will people demand an entire change of everything? Or are they just going to demand crumbs?
Well, sorry to interrupt, but that's the problem. The problem is in America, for the majority of people, their attention spans are 10 seconds or less. They forget about everything that happened just a matter of 2 or 3 years ago, never mind what's going on now. And that 2 or 3 years ago, what happened there, that was a life-changing experience for not only America, but for the world. And we can't even hold our politicians to justice on that. We'll get into that in just a moment. I do want to speak about the banking system, as I said, for people listening. Diane Sear here on Fire Breathing Rob. It's sear4senate.com. She's running for U.S. Senate in New York in 2024. Continuing on to these audience questions and what people are asking me to ask you, healthcare, obviously a huge issue. Throughout the past 3 years, a lot of people still don't have health care. The Biden administration got rid of the health care as far as Medicaid that he was giving to people that were not under the Obama exchange as far as Obamacare goes. They're on their own right now. Are you for or against Medicare for all? If you are not for Medicare for all, are you for a public option? What is your stance as far as health care in America?
Well, it's complex. I think we have to get to Medicare for all. I support that in principle. The problem we have right now is we are not even able to deliver the care. We have gouged the healthcare system. It is unbelievable. There are parts of the United States where women have to drive 3 hours to get a mammogram. Right.
Well, I was also told, because you're in New York, obviously running for Senate there, that due to the mandates, some of these hospitals are so understaffed because of the mandates, the care is close to zero.
Right. They're talking right now. Apparently, there are 27 rural hospitals in New York that are on the brink of shutting down.
Wow.
I reached out to a friend of mine who is in healthcare and who happens to work now in a congressman's office to say, do you know which hospitals? And he said, no, it's closely guarded. So people may think there's a hospital in their neighborhood and they're going to discover it's not there. And I would say it was the mandates, but it wasn't only the mandates. Look at the nurse to patient ratios. That's what nurses are asking for everywhere. Right. And they weren't staffing the hospitals adequately in the first place. You have incredible burnout of people. And then to save money, they don't have RNs. They have lower level people. LPNs are trying to either do functions that the RNs do. And they have a bizarre division. I saw this when my mother was in the hospital, where the same person is not on top of every aspect. So she had major surgery and she wasn't eating, but the person doing the food somehow wasn't communicating with, they didn't know until she'd lost about 15 pounds that she was unable to swallow, right? I mean, this kind of thing. So people are getting ground up, and now they have this thing from COVID called the visiting nurses or traveling nurses, right, who get paid triple what the local nurses do, and they can't travel because maybe they have kids in the local school or whatever, so they can't run around the country. So then this creates this enormous friction because you have someone coming in doing the same job as you, getting paid 3 times what you're getting paid for it, and they want you to work together. And then the nurses what they're saying, and they really should be listened to. They're the ones delivering the care. If they say the ratio of patients to nurses isn't working, and they're afraid that someone's going to die because they can't be at 8 bedsides simultaneously, then someone should listen to that. And it also shows you it's not about money, because we have money to pay people triple, but we don't have money to just hire more help for the places where people are. And I would say you have this in spades at the senior citizens' homes and the veterans, where they have much people with fewer degrees, and they pay them barely anything. I mean, it's a big thing here in New York. I think they just got a pay increase for home health aides. And anyone who's had a sick relative with home, you know how hard these people work. They work hard, and they travel, and they put their lives at risk, and they're getting paid nothing.
Well, not even just to mention that you go into a doctor's office, if you can even get an appointment with the specialists, it's like 6 months. With a regular doctor, who knows, you might be able to get in. But once you get in, it's like a speed round. It's like you're being timed. It's like 8 minutes, 5 minutes, and then they're out of there. And then they're looking at the computer the whole time, not even asking you any questions. It's a total joke, our healthcare system, and I have to laugh when people say, "Oh, America," all these people that are Canadians, they come to America for healthcare. I'm sure a couple of them do, but I know a lot of them are going to Canada. Bernie Sanders has done this. Many other politicians have showcased this. They're going to Canada for medication, for doctor's visits, because they can't get into these hospitals, or they can't get into these doctor's offices. So it's a sham. But just to put the exclamation point on this, Diane. So are you for something like a public option to start out with, and then maybe move to Medicare for all?
What I would do is a little differently, which is to go back to something like the Hill-Burton Act, which was passed after World War II, which mandated a certain number of hospital beds per capita. At that time, it was 4.5 beds per 1,000 population. And it varied. For rural areas, you had a higher number of beds per 1,000, because you wanted to make sure the hospitals were not too far away. Right. Now there's so many things that have upgraded where you can have outpatient surgery. Maybe it's 3 beds per 1,000, but still, and the US is way below this. And we saw it when COVID broke out first, right? Everything was suddenly overwhelmed. Our hospital bed ratio per capita is very bad. So, and what Hill-Burton means is that hospitals in rural areas are bailed out. Right? If you're in some poor area in Mississippi and you have an indigent population that you're serving, why should that hospital be rated on whether patients come back? Right? This is one of the horrible things. Hospitals don't get reimbursed if they readmit a patient in a certain amount of time. So hospitals are disincentivized from taking people who are very sick, because it makes them look bad and they don't get funded. So I think the first thing we have to do is say, no, there's a standard where you need X number of beds per capita. You need cancer clinics. We shut down a zillion cancer clinics when Obamacare began, right? So you say, if this hospital is not making enough money to stay in, then we're going to bail it out. And I'll tell you, bailing out that hospital would be a lot less money than we spend on AIG or all this other crap that we just bailed out.
That's true. I want to get into these, and I want to be graciously at time and get into these audience questions as we keep going into this interview. Talking about the mandates, I'm pretty sure by hearing what you're saying throughout the past, 20-ish minutes, you're against these mandates. They hurt a lot of people. They're still being pushed in New York. A lot of these people that have won court cases in New York, the sanitary workers, I've heard this, and you can correct the record on this if you know this, that they might have won the case, but they still haven't got the back pay. They still haven't got the jobs back for the majority of these people. And there's also other mandates that are still in place by Governor Hochul that haven't been put in play. So again, obviously you're running on the national level, but you're still obviously working for the people of the state of New York. If elected, what is your position on these mandates, and how will you push as a senator? Because obviously you have a higher position than the governor of the state and Kathy Hochul. Push her to say, hey, listen, you got to get rid of some of this stuff. It's hurting not only the community, but the country as that goes too.
Right. Well, again, and this may surprise you, but I'll tell you, I wouldn't oppose if you had an actual real health crisis where there was a very high percentage of deaths.
Would you say that COVID was a real health crisis or no?
It was made into one because of the way we handled it.
Fair enough. I respect that.
I was in New York City and I saw hospitals overflowing and morgues. And then I saw that, we had the hospital ship that no one used. It was unbelievably insane. And you had poor people dying in huge numbers, like the NYCHA housing, where the air ventilation people had a job. And they said, this is an issue. These houses have no proper vent. Forget COVID, any disease, right? I mean, so but if you, for example, measles, when that was an issue, polio, I'm not against vaccines per se as a scientific principle. What I oppose is things that are completely arbitrary being imposed because people are making money from it, where the highest bidder gets it. People denounce China. They had very strict lockdowns, but one thing of interest, they didn't ever lock down the whole country. And their lockdowns were based on testing. That is, if they found cases, they would do a lockdown and then they would test 15 million people in 3 days, find out where the infection was, deal with it, and things would reopen. So and then once it got to be the things weren't severe and whatever, there were some protests and they changed their policy and they've opened up. That's very different than saying, we're going to make an arbitrary one size fits all policy. We don't care if you're positive or negative, you're sick or you're not sick. We're going to just lock down across the board and everyone's going to go along with it. And you have to say, if you're going to do anything like that, there has to be a bond of trust between the people and the government. There is no reason for the people to trust the government right now.
We hear a lot about Bitcoin. We know what the truck is in Canada, what was done to them as far as financial means that due to them not getting the thing, or some of them did get the thing. They just were against the mandates and they were protesting. The president of that country did shut down their bank accounts. Right. Now, if they had Bitcoin, it could have been a whole different ball game. Let's talk a little bit about Bitcoin, what your opinion is on that, and also about this central bank digital currency, which I think, when we talk about our freedoms getting really cut, they're already cut in half a lot. And if that comes into play, we're really screwed in plain English.
Right. Well, I think, unfortunately, the Bitcoin thing is a bit of a fraud.
Okay.
Because it is online and ultimately they could control it as well. And we see governments that, like in El Salvador, unfortunately got lured into it and had catastrophic results. So I think we can't escape from the necessity of establishing a government that's trustworthy.
Yeah.
We have to do that. Absolutely, central bank digital currency is a disaster. I don't think central banks should be allowed to run countries. And I don't think we should have a central bank. We should have a national bank, as in our Constitution, which is answerable to our elected officials. And if the American people can't get it together to put elected officials in office who represent them, can't get it together to demand transparent and fair elections, ultimately we have to hold ourselves responsible for what these criminals are doing. Right now, we don't have a national bank. We have a private Federal Reserve that gets to do whatever it wants. And they have slimy meetings at the Grove, and God knows what goes on there. I don't think we'd want to know.
No, no, thank you.
So that's really the problem.
So Christian Gillibrand is running. Obviously, you're running against her. Now, as an independent, you don't have to run a primary race, correct?
Right.
Okay, so you're running for November of 2024. So you have plenty of time right now to run against her. With that said, obviously she's establishment. Obviously, New Yorkers are very much Democratic, although we did see some, I think, breaking of that Democratic establishment hold in the governor's race, where Lee Zeldin came extremely close to winning that governor's race back in 2022, but it's still held for Kathy Hochul. How do you, as an independent, which the Democratic establishment and the Republican establishment in general, but more so the Democratic establishment, because you're a person that I truly believe can pick off both sides, but picking off a lot of these Democrat votes will really gain ground because Gillibrand is the favorite as far as winning the Democrat primary and also winning that general because it is a Democratic state. So how can you beat this establishment? We know what they did in New York to Bernie as far as 2016. We know what they've done in the past to many independent candidates as far as the Democratic establishment goes. So how do you beat these people that really have a hold on New York politics in the state of New York?
Well, I think reality is the biggest factor in this. The fact that the banking system is going to crash, that people's energy bills are going to be through the ceiling and they won't even have energy because we shut down Indian Point nuclear plant and then Hochul is banning fossil fuels on top of it. So forget it. You'll have 1 million solar panels in your backyard and they'll be covered with snow and there you'll be. I mean, the conditions are going to be bad. I will also say about Gillibrand, it's very interesting because she keeps a low profile relatively, but she replaced Hillary Clinton. She was very close, is very close to Hillary Clinton. And her husband is British. His father was a major executive with British Aerospace, one of the major military industrial complex companies, and which has had very nefarious dealings with Saudi Arabia, for example. And she's on the Intelligence Committee. So while Schumer is sort of a smelly weasel who seems to have no moral, he just kind of does vicious, nasty, dishonest stuff as just it's all in a day's work. And people rightly hate him. He's the majority leader in the Senate. She, in a way, I think could even be more nefarious because she runs around. She started this weekly newsletter, a monthly, called a New York Minute, and it's all pictures of her handing out cupcakes at nursing homes and talking about how she got someone's tax rebate back after 5 years and all the little nice things that she's supposedly doing. Meanwhile, she's there. She's one of the prime sponsors of this Restrict Act, which I think was so egregious it died. She was a prime sponsor of that, which is that you can go to jail for up to 20 years and pay $250,000 fine for spreading false narratives about elections or anything else. And the FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, doesn't apply. So you never get to find out what you're charged with. So what kind of person would introduce such legislation?
Yeah. It's really sad what's going on in the country in general. And I don't know too much about Christian Gillibrand. I know that she ran for president. Obviously, as you stated, she ran for Hillary's spot and won that election. But other than that, like you said, she has a very low profile. I don't even know that about her husband, that he was involved with the military industrial complex that much. But, you have to win Republican voters too. I think that you kind of could hit both sides. The anti-war left And also, there's an anti-war due to, I believe, Donald Trump, whether we like him or not. He's brought a lot of these people out that are anti-war. They are America first. Is that what you're expecting to take the anti-war left that's sick of the Democratic establishment, and also the anti-war right that's kind of fed up with not only the mandates, but the establishment politics of the Republicans in general?
Well, yes, and also the economy. I
Yeah.
mean, there's only a tiny percentage of people who are benefiting from hyperinflation. And once people's bank accounts get frozen or whatever is going to happen. I mean, when they had this, so just to give an example, because everyone thinks, oh no, that'll never happen. And they bailed out. You realize the bailout they just did, which was about 700 billion with Silicon Valley Bank and Silvergate and that other one in San Diego. And then you had Credit Suisse, and that was about 700 billion and didn't even go through the Congress. So now they don't even consult with the Congress. They just violate the Federal Deposit Insurance Act and do whatever they want. But there was a moment there where someone I know has a bank, supposedly no connection to Silicon Valley, had to issue payroll to his employees. Well, his account said the payroll had gone out, no one had gotten paid. When he contacted the bank, they said, well, our payroll account is handled through Silicon Valley Bank. So literally the whole pay had just gone into cyberspace. And then when they got the money, they did get paid after that bailout. But think about that. This thing is so interconnected. The so-called, that's why you need Glass-Steagall. You need emergency action to save the commercial banks, keep them transparent, solvent. You'd have to bail out people's pension funds. The things that people depend on have to be saved. And the guy who was betting on mortgage-backed securities in Tahiti and what they're going to be worth in 2033, if he loses a few million, okay, he probably can afford it. He's not going to die, and no one will. So let that crap go, write off the debt, save what's needed, but you can't do that unless you have a Glass-Steagall firewall, bank protection up in place.
I agree with you 100%. That was a huge loss in the Clinton administration with them getting, and we know who he was in cahoots with Robert Rubin and that group, uh, as far as that goes. But that was a huge loss with the Glass-Steagall Act being repealed. Let's end with this. We've talked about a lot of different things. We probably could go on here for about 2 or 3 hours and not even get to every issue in the kitchen sink, but we'll end here. But I want you to tell the viewers that are listening, what do you hope that they learned from our interview today the most about your run for U.S. Senate?
Wow, that's an interesting question. No one asked me. That there's hope, that there's people who are willing to listen, and that there are people who really love our nation and want to revive the principles on which our nation was founded. And I would hope that people want to join me in that. I think that we do. I think Americans are very good people, very dedicated people. We had a coup in 1963 when Kennedy was assassinated, and that has not been undone. Instead, the people who did that have been running the country. And I think we can reverse that, but it's going to take a movement.
Sound like RFK Jr. That's the guy that I'm voting for. That's why I stayed a Democrat. Otherwise, I would be long gone from that party. It's a total joke. But that's my opinion. I know we have some liberals and Democrats that are listening, and more kudos to them. We'll end there. Again, for people listening, it's SARE4Senate.com. Diane, before we go, people can follow you on social media. What are your links for that as we end this interview?
Please knock on wood. SARE for Senate on Facebook, and that's the number 4 that time, SARE number 4 Senate. On Twitter, it's just Diane Sayre. I have an Instagram account, but I switched phones and can't get at it, so it's sort of
frustrating.
Yeah, and then I'm also occasionally on Twitter, which is also, I think, SARE for Senate, and Rumble. I have a Rumble account as well. I think
is it SARE for Senate in Rumble too?
Yeah, with the number 4. I believe that's what it is. Terrible. I
Well,
should know better. I always knock on wood because you never know when you're going to be deplatformed on various of these things.
you
Rumble,
ain't kidding.
that, but
Well, Rumble, thank God they don't do that. So we're thankful for that.
yeah,
I learned a little bit the hard way on YouTube with the strikes and stuff. It's very unfortunate that we lost our freedom of speech in this country, especially the Patriot Act killed a lot of rights for us as Americans going back to after 9/11. But then, with the virus issue, that really took everything that we had left pretty much
right.
out. But we'll end there again. Diane Sear for Senate, searforsenate.com. Definitely check her out. Diane, I hope we can have you on again. You really are a breath of fresh air. I'm in Florida, but if I was in New York, I would vote for you because the principles you really represent is the principles for most Americans. If they're not the principles for most Americans, they're probably not American, and we don't want them in this country in general. but I do appreciate you coming on and really speaking to our millennials and our older viewers that we do have that listen to this program around the country. So thanks again so much.
Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.